Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The air in Corridor 7 tasted of recycled oxygen and cold metal, a flavor Kalen had long ago stopped noticing. It was the taste of his life, thin and artificial. He stood his post, rifle held in a loose but ready grip, his gaze sweeping the featureless gray walls. The only sound was the low, pervasive hum of the station's life support, a constant reminder that outside this pressurized shell lay the airless, ash-strewn surface of the moon they called Erebus. For 10 years, since the consortium had seen fit to retire him from the front lines with a pension of indentured servitude, this had been his world. A world of corridors, alert klaxons, and the quiet, simmering resentment of a man who had been promised a hero's peace and given a guard's cage. His designated sector included the primary containment cell, designated XC-7. Inside, behind a triple-pane sheet of reinforced plasteel, was the asset, the creature. The consortium scientists had a dozen clinical names for her, but to the guards, she was simply the Witch of Cygnus X-1, the sole survivor of a planetary pacification campaign Kalen himself had fought in. He remembered the world not as a home, but as a target, a place of swirling dust storms and ghost-like figures that flitted through the canyons, their weapons firing bolts of coherent light that peeled armor from tanks like fruit from its rind. They had fought with a ferocity he had never seen before or since, and they had died with the same silent intensity. All but one. He watched her now. She sat on the cold metal floor of her sterile white cell, still as a statue carved from pale stone. Her form was humanoid, but taller, more slender, with skin the color of twilight and hair like spun silver that cascaded over her shoulders. She wore the simple gray tunic of a high-value specimen, a stark contrast to the intricate, almost living patterns that occasionally swirled just beneath her skin, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. Her eyes, large and dark, were closed. The scientists said she was dormant, conserving energy. Kalen thought she was simply waiting. He had seen that kind of stillness before, in the moments before an ambush. A new pair of technicians approached the cell, their white lab coats pristine against the grime of the station. One was a senior biologist named Eris, a man whose clinical detachment barely masked a cruel curiosity. The other was a nervous junior tech, his hands trembling as he held a diagnostic slate. Kalen straightened his posture slightly, the movement automatic, a ghost of military discipline. Eris nodded curtly at him, a dismissal more than a greeting, and pressed his palm to the access panel. The heavy door hissed open. Subject's biosignatures are flagging again, Eris said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. He gestured for the junior tech to begin the scan. Dehydration is reaching critical levels. It refuses sustenance. The word it grated on Kalen, as it always did. He had killed her people, burned their homes, and followed his orders without question. But looking at her, so utterly defeated and yet radiating a defiant dignity, he could not bring himself to see an object. He saw a prisoner of a war she had already lost. The young tech moved forward, his scanner emitting a low hum. The creature, the woman, did not stir. Her stillness was absolute, a wall of silent defiance. Eris grumbled in frustration. Physical inducement is required. The nutrient paste must be administered. He produced a long, sterile injector from his kit. It was a brutal-looking instrument, designed for livestock, not sentient beings. The younger tech flinched. Kalen felt a familiar, ugly knot tighten in his gut. It was the same feeling he'd had on Cygnus X-1, watching his platoon level a village of woven crystal that sang in the wind. The feeling of participating in something profoundly wrong. "Hold," Kalen said. His voice was rough from disuse. Eris turned, his eyebrows raised in annoyance. "Warden's orders, Corporal. I am to ensure the asset remains viable. Step aside." "There's no need for that," Kalen said, his eyes fixed on the still figure in the cell. He had seen the way she recoiled from their instruments, the faint tremor that ran through her frame when they touched her with cold metal. But he had also seen her, once, when a maintenance drone had dropped a container of purified water, watch the clear liquid pool on the floor with an expression of profound longing. "Just give her water." The scientist scoffed. "It has refused all liquids. We've tried. The subject is non-compliant. You tried to force it through a tube, Kalen countered, stepping forward until he blocked the cell entrance. His rifle was still pointed at the floor, but its presence was a statement. Leave the water. A simple container. Let's see what happens when you're not standing over her with a needle. Eris's face hardened. He was not used to being questioned by a low-level guard, a washed-up soldier. Your sentimentality is noted, Corporal. It is also irrelevant. Now move, or I will have you reported for insubordination. For a long moment, Kalen did not move. He weighed the consequences. A reprimand. Extra shifts. A pay dock. Or he could simply step aside and let them proceed. Let them violate this last vestige of a dying race. He looked past Eris, into the cell. The woman's eyes were open now, fixed on him. They were deep, fathomless pools of black, and in them, he saw not a plea for help, but a flicker of acknowledgement. An assessment. In that instant, a decade of weariness and self-loathing coalesced into a single, sharp point of decision. He unclipped a water canister from his own utility belt. It was his personal ration, pure and cold. Without breaking eye contact with her, he twisted the cap and extended his hand toward the junior technician. Give this to her. No scanners, no injectors, just the water. The young tech looked from Kalen's hard-set face to Eris's furious one, paralyzed with indecision. Eris took a step forward, his hand reaching for the comlink on his wrist. This is your final warning, Corporal. Before Eris could activate the link, Kalen moved. It was not a violent motion, but it was swift and decisive. He took the canister himself, stepped past the fuming scientist, and entered the cell. The sterile air was colder inside, carrying a faint, ozone-like scent that seemed to emanate from the woman. He knelt, placing the open canister on the floor a respectful distance from her. He did not look at her, but he could feel her gaze on him, a palpable weight. Then he stood, turned, and walked back to his post outside the cell door, leaving Eris and the junior tech staring after him in stunned silence. He had broken protocol. He had defied a direct order. He had committed an act of simple, inexplicable kindness. And in doing so, he had sealed his fate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Eris seemed to recover his senses, his face contorting with rage. He was about to shout for the guards when the woman moved. Slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature so long captive, she reached for the canister. Her long, slender fingers closed around it. She lifted it to her lips and drank, her throat working as she drained the entire container. When she was finished, she set it down gently. Then she looked up, her dark eyes meeting Kalen's through the plasteel. A single, shimmering tear, like a drop of liquid starlight, traced a path down her pale cheek. And then the world exploded into light and sound. The lights in the corridor flickered and died, plunging them into the crimson glow of the emergency strobes. A piercing alarm shrieked through the station, a sound that signaled a catastrophic breach. Kalen instinctively brought his rifle up, his body tensing for a fight. Inside the cell, the woman stood. The luminescent patterns under her skin blazed with incandescent power, casting the sterile room in an ethereal blue light. The plasteel door, rated to withstand a direct hit from a bunker-busting missile, began to groan and buckle as if under immense, invisible pressure. Containment failure. Sector 7. Eris screamed into his calm, his scientific composure shattered into pure terror. He scrambled backward, away from the warping door. The asset is loose. Repeat, the asset is loose. Kalen didn't wait. He knew what was coming. He had seen what her people could do with their minds alone. The door wasn't just being pushed, it was being unwritten from reality. The metal screamed as its molecular bonds were torn apart, and then it imploded into a shower of white-hot sparks. The woman stepped out of the cell, the blue light radiating from her in waves. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a force of nature unleashed. The junior tech fainted, collapsing to the floor. Eris turned to run, but a gesture from her, a mere flick of her wrist, sent him flying down the corridor to crash into the far wall with a sickening thud. She turned her attention to Kalen. He stood his ground, his rifle aimed at her chest, but his finger was nowhere near the trigger. He was a traitor now, an accomplice. His life as he knew it was over. He could shoot her and perhaps be hailed as a hero who stopped a monster, or he could accept the consequences of his choice. Her dark eyes searched his, not with malice, but with an intensity that seemed to peel back the layers of his soul. He saw flashes in his mind, not thoughts, but feelings, images. A dying sun, a field of crystal flowers turning to dust, the faces of his comrades falling in a war he no longer understood. He was seeing her memories, feeling her grief. The station's internal defense systems came online. Automated turrets descended from the ceiling, their targeting lasers painting red dots on her body. Before they could fire, she raised her hands, and the turrets were crushed into balls of twisted metal, their barrels bent and their power cells exploding in showers of sparks. She was a whirlwind of controlled destruction, dismantling the station's defenses with contemptuous ease. A squad of heavily armed guards rounded the corner, their armor gleaming in the flashing red lights. "Drop your weapon and get on the ground," the squad leader yelled at Kalen, his voice amplified by his helmet. "You are under arrest for treason." Kalen lowered his rifle slowly, but he didn't drop it. He was caught between two unstoppable forces, the wrath of the consortium and the power of the being he had just freed. The woman glanced at him, then at the approaching soldiers. A silent question passed between them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not them. They're just soldiers. Like I was." She seemed to understand. Instead of attacking them, she slammed her palm against the floor. A shockwave of pure force erupted from the point of impact, buckling the deck plates and sending the entire squad staggering. The floor beneath them collapsed, dropping them to the maintenance level below, tangled but alive. She looked at him again, then pointed down a secondary service corridor, one Kalen knew led to the outer docking bays. It was an escape route, an offer. His heart hammered in his chest. Fleeing with her meant becoming a fugitive, hunted across the galaxy. Staying meant a summary execution. There was no real choice. He gave a sharp nod, and together, they ran. Their flight was a blur of chaos. Alarms blared a station-wide alert, naming him specifically, Corporal Kalen, traitor, to be shot on sight. They moved through the labyrinthine corridors, a strange and desperate pair. He was the guide, his knowledge of the station's layout, their only map. He pointed the way through forgotten maintenance tunnels and depressurized cargo holds, his mind racing, processing tactical options with a speed he hadn't used in years. She was the key, the weapon. Doors sealed in their path were torn from their hinges. Squads of guards were thrown aside by waves of invisible force. She moved with a lethal economy, never using more power than necessary, disabling rather than killing, a restraint that struck Kalen as profoundly alien. Distrust was a chasm between them. He was constantly aware of the immense power radiating from her, a power that could extinguish him in a heartbeat. He was one of the men who had destroyed her world, a cog in the machine that had caged her. For her part, she watched him with a wary, analytical gaze, as if trying to understand the strange impulse that had led him to offer her water. They were allies of circumstance, bound only by the mutual threat of the consortium. They reached the primary hangar bay for the haulers, a vast, cavernous space that smelled of ozone and hot metal. A heavy transport ship was being prepped for departure, its engines whining as they warmed up. It was their only way off this rock, but their path was blocked. Standing before the ship's ramp was Sub-Warden Jax, flanked by a dozen elite soldiers in matte black shock armor. Jax was a man who had built his career on ambition and cruelty, and he had always held a special contempt for Kalen, the decorated war veteran relegated to a guard's post. "Kalen," Jax's voice boomed over the hangar's comm system, dripping with smug satisfaction. "I knew you were rotten to the core. A sympathizer, letting the asset out of its cage. The warden wants it back, alive. He was less specific about you." Kalen pushed the woman behind him, raising his rifle. "Stand down, Jax. You're outmatched." Jax laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Are we? My men have inertial dampeners. Her little push-and-pull tricks won't work so well on them. And you? You're just one man with a standard-issue pulse rifle." He gestured, and his soldiers raised their weapons, a dozen red targeting lasers converging on Kalen's chest. This was it. A dead end. Kalen braced himself, ready to sell his life as dearly as possible. He could maybe take out 2 or 3 of them before they cut him down. But then, the woman stepped out from behind him. The blue light within her flared, but this time it was different. It didn't lash out. Instead, It coalesced around her, forming a shimmering, translucent barrier. "Fire!" Jax commanded. The hangar erupted in a storm of pulse rounds. The air crackled with energy as dozens of superheated plasma bolts converged on their position. Kalen flinched, expecting to be vaporized. But every single shot slammed into the shimmering shield and dissolved into harmless light. The barrier held, absorbing the onslaught without a flicker. The woman stood serene in the heart of the storm, her eyes closed, her hands held open at her sides. Kalen stared in awe. It was not an act of aggression, but one of pure defense. She was protecting him. The barrage lasted for 10 full seconds, and then the soldiers' rifles fell silent, their energy packs depleted. In that moment of quiet, the woman's eyes snapped open. The shield dissolved, and the energy it had absorbed was unleashed in a single, focused wave. It didn't throw the soldiers, it hit their weapons, causing every rifle to overheat and explode in their hands. The shock troopers cried out in pain and surprise, disarmed and momentarily stunned. It was the opening they needed. "Now!" Kalen yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the transport's ramp. They sprinted across the hangar floor, the shouts of Jax and his men echoing behind them. They scrambled up the ramp just as the ship's pilot, spooked by the firefight, began to retract it. Kalen fired a single shot into the ramp controls, shorting them out and freezing it in place. He bundled her into the cargo hold and slammed the interior door shut, then raced for the cockpit. The pilot, a nervous contractor with wide, terrified eyes, was trying to communicate with the station tower. Kalen leveled his rifle at him. "Get us out of here. Now, or we all die." The pilot, seeing the cold certainty in Kalen's eyes, didn't argue. He slammed his hands on the console, and the transport's engines roared to life. The ship lurched, lifting from the hangar deck. Jax and his men had recovered and were firing their sidearms, the shots pinging uselessly off the ship's armored hull. Kalen watched through the cockpit viewport as Station Epsilon shrank behind them, a gray scar on the desolate face of the moon. They were free, and they were utterly alone. The transport ship was an old, battered, or hauler, its hull pockmarked with micrometeorite impacts. The air inside was thick with the metallic tang of dust and the faint smell of engine lubricant. Kalen had forced the pilot into a storage locker after making sure the ship was on a stable trajectory away from Erebus. He now sat in the pilot's chair, watching the starfield slowly turn outside the viewport. The woman, whom he had begun to think of as Lyra, a name he'd heard one of the younger, more sympathetic scientists use, stood behind him, her silence a heavy presence in the small cockpit. They had escaped the station, but they were adrift in a hostile universe. The consortium controlled every major shipping lane, every starport, every habitable world in this sector. The transport had limited supplies and fuel. They were fugitives with nowhere to run. Kalen felt the crushing weight of his decision settle upon him. He had traded a slow death in a cage for a fast one in the void. He felt a light touch on his shoulder and turned to see her standing beside him. She pointed a slender finger at the navigation console, then toward a desolate, uncharted region of space marked on the star charts only by a string of hazard warnings, gravitational anomalies, asteroid fields, stellar radiation. It was a place ships went to die. "There," he asked, his voice hoarse. "That's suicide." She did not speak, but she met his gaze and projected another series of images into his mind. This time they were clearer, more deliberate. She showed him a hidden world, a moon cloaked in nebulae, orbiting a dying star. She showed him canyons of glowing crystal, just like the ones he had helped destroy, and a small settlement of survivors. Her people, they were hiding in the one place the consortium would never look. It was a desperate, dangerous journey, but it was a destination. It was hope. He nodded slowly, a silent agreement. He turned back to the console and plotted the course, the ship's computer chirping a series of warnings about the risks involved. He ignored them. Risk was all they had left. Their journey through the wasteland of space was a trial by fire and ice. They navigated through dense asteroid fields, the ship's hull groaning under the impact of smaller rocks. Kalen's hands slick on the controls as he dodged the larger ones. Lyra proved to be an invaluable co-pilot. She could sense gravitational fluctuations before the ship's instruments could detect them, guiding his hands with gentle pressure on his shoulder, helping him weave a safe path through the chaos. Days bled into one another, marked only by the ship's chronometer. They spoke little, their communication evolving into a language of gestures and shared understanding. He learned that the faint light under her skin brightened when she was calm and pulsed with a harsh, erratic rhythm when she was agitated. She learned the subtle shifts in his posture that betrayed his own anxiety or exhaustion. They shared the meager rations in silence, a ritual that became the new cornerstone of their existence. One cycle, as he was patching a section of conduit that had been damaged during a rough passage through a plasma storm, his tunic rode up, revealing the scarred, burnished skin on his back. It was a relic from the Siege of Orion, where a plasma grenade had melted his armor to his flesh. He felt her gaze on the marks and instinctively tried to cover them, a reflexive motion born of shame. He had earned those scars fighting for the very people who had enslaved her. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the largest scar. Her touch was not cold, as he had expected, but warm, and a strange, soothing energy seemed to flow from her fingertips, easing the phantom ache that sometimes still lingered in the old wound. She did not recoil from the mark of his violent past. Instead, she looked at him with an expression of profound empathy. Then, she lowered the collar of her own tunic. Across her collarbone was a thin, jagged scar, not from a weapon, but from the repeated application of a medical instrument. It was a mark of captivity, of violation. It was her own history of pain, laid bare for him to see. In that moment, the chasm of distrust between them finally closed. They were no longer soldier and prisoner, human and alien. They were survivors, two scarred souls bound by a shared ordeal. As they drew closer to their destination, she began to share more with him. She did not use words, but projected her thoughts directly into his mind, a stream of memories and emotions that was at once overwhelming and illuminating. He saw her world as it was before the consortium arrived, a planet of breathtaking beauty, where her people lived in harmony with the living energy of the world itself. They were not warriors, but custodians, their magic, a deep, resonant connection to the planet's core. He learned the truth of the war. The consortium had not come for resources in the traditional sense. They had come for the planet's heart. They saw it as an infinite power source, a wellspring of energy that could fuel their expansion for 1,000 years. When Lyra's people refused to surrender it, the consortium fabricated a story of a hostile, savage race, a threat to galactic peace. They had manufactured a war to justify a planetary theft. Warden Valerius, then a decorated admiral, had been the architect of it all. He had led the final assault, shattering their cities and severing their connection to the planet's core, leaving them broken and scattered. Lyra had been captured because she was a key, one of a handful of her people with the innate ability to commune directly with the core. Valerius had kept her alive, studying her, torturing her, trying to force her to reveal the secret of controlling the energy. Her escape had not just been a flight for freedom. It was a catastrophic blow to Valerius's ambitions. He would not stop until he had her back. He would burn half the galaxy to find her. The weight of this revelation settled on Kalen like a shroud. The medals on his uniform, the commendations for valor, the memories of fallen friends, they were all built on a foundation of lies. He had been the monster in someone else's story. He looked at Lyra, at the immense sorrow and resilience in her eyes, and he felt a profound and terrible shame. His duty had been a lie, his honor a fabrication. All that was left was the choice he had made in that sterile corridor, the one small act of defiance that had set them on this path. He knew then that this was no longer just about survival. It was about atonement. They arrived at the hidden moon, a small, gray orb nestled in the swirling crimson and gold of a dying nebula. Following Lyra's guidance, Kalen navigated the ship through a narrow canyon, its walls lined with the same glowing crystals she had shown him in her memories. They landed in a hidden cave behind a waterfall of shimmering, energized particles. The moment the ship's engines powered down, the silence was absolute. A small party of her people emerged from the shadows of the cave. They were gaunt and weary, their numbers tragically few, but their eyes held the same fierce dignity as Lyra's. They looked at Kalen with suspicion and hostility, their hands gripping crude, hand-fashioned energy weapons. He was the enemy, an embodiment of their destruction. He stood his ground, making no move for his weapon. Lyra stepped forward, placing herself between Kaelin and her kin. She spoke to them, her voice a low, melodic language that sounded like wind chimes. She gestured toward Kaelin, and as she spoke, she projected her feelings to the others, her trust in him, the story of his sacrifice, the bond they had forged. The hostility in their eyes did not vanish, but it softened into a cautious acceptance. An elder, his face a mask of ancient sorrow, stepped forward and gave Kaelin a slow, formal nod. He had been granted sanctuary. For a time, there was a fragile peace. Kaelin helped them fortify their defenses, his military expertise proving invaluable. He taught them tactical discipline, how to set up kill zones and overlapping fields of fire. In return, they showed him their ways, how they coaxed food from hydroponic gardens and drew power from the moon's geothermal vents. He saw the remnants of a culture of profound beauty and wisdom, and the pain of their loss became a constant, dull ache in his chest. But their peace was short-lived. A long-range scout drone, a stray remnant of the consortium's vast network, stumbled upon their hiding place. They shot it down, but not before it broadcast their location. Kaelin saw the alert on the ship's comms, a high-priority transmission burst directed back toward the core systems. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Valerius knew where they were. They did not have to wait long. Within a week, a fleet of consortium warships dropped out of hyperspace, forming a blockade around the moon. Their angular, brutalist designs were a stark contrast to the swirling beauty of the nebula. At their head was the Iron Hand, Valerius's flagship. A single transmission was broadcast on all frequencies, the warden's voice cold and imperious. Surrender the asset and the traitor Kaelin. Your cooperation will be noted. Resistance will result in planetary sterilization. You have one standard hour. Panic rippled through the small community. They had only a handful of fighters cobbled together from scavenged parts and one damaged or hauler. Against a battle fleet, they stood no chance. Lyra's people looked to her, their faces etched with despair. This was the end. Kaelin stood beside her, watching the tactical display. Dozens of enemy ships, thousands of soldiers. It was an overwhelming, unwinnable force. He had seen this before. It was the consortium's way, not to win a battle, but to annihilate any and all opposition. They would not just take Lyra. They would scour this moon of every living thing to make an example of them. We can't fight them, he said, his voice flat. Not like this. Lyra turned to him, her face grim. I know. She projected a new thought into his mind, an idea born of desperation. There is another way, but the cost is absolute. She led him deep into the heart of the crystalline caves, to a central chamber where the glowing rock formations converged. In the center of the chamber was a pool of liquid light, a place of immense power. It was a focal point, a connection to the life force of this moon, a faint echo of the great planetary core they had lost. This place has power, she explained, her mental voice laced with sorrow. It can be amplified, focused. We can create a shield, a barrier of energy so absolute that nothing can penetrate it. It would sever this moon from the rest of the universe, make it a perfect sanctuary. The consortium would be locked out forever. Kaelin looked at the pool of light, then back at her. He could sense the unspoken part of her plan. What's the cost? The shield requires a constant, conscious will to maintain it, she replied. It needs a mind to anchor it, to become its nexus. A conductor. My people have done this before, in ages past, to weather cosmic storms. But the process is irreversible. The conductor's consciousness is merged with the energy of the shield. Their body perishes. Their mind becomes the guardian, eternal and alone. It is a sacrifice of the self. She looked away, her own form trembling slightly. I was trained for this. I was meant to be the next guardian for my homeworld. But my time in the consortium's cell, it weakened me. I was severed from the core for too long. My connection is damaged. If I attempt the ritual now, I will fail. The energy will be uncontrolled. It will destroy this moon, not save it. Kaelin stared into the swirling light, the impossible truth of their situation crashing down on him. A solution that was no solution at all. A door with only one key, and the key was broken. He felt the last vestiges of hope wither and die within him. Then, A new thought, cold and clear as crystal, began to form in his mind. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of fighting meaningless wars. He thought of his empty existence on Station Epsilon, of the quiet despair that had been his only companion. And he thought of Lyra, of the single act of kindness that had led him here, to a cause that finally felt real. His life had been spent in service to a lie. Perhaps it could end in service to the truth. "What if the conductor wasn't one of your people?" he asked slowly, the words feeling heavy and strange on his tongue. "You said the anchor needs a conscious will, a mind." Lyra looked at him, her dark eyes widening as she understood his meaning. A human? The psychic shock, the foreign biology, no one knows what would happen. The energy might simply annihilate you. The pain would be unimaginable. "Pain is something I understand," Kalen said, his voice quiet but firm. "My mind is disciplined. I was a soldier for 20 years. I know how to hold a position." He looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, he allowed a faint, sad smile to touch his lips. "Let me do this. Let my last act be one that matters." The final hour ticked away. On the tactical display, the consortium fleet began to move into bombardment positions. There was no more time for debate. Lyra looked at Kalen, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She saw the quiet, unshakable resolve on his face. This was not a rash impulse. It was a calculated decision, the final, logical step for a man who had lost everything and found one thing worth dying for. She did not argue. She did not try to dissuade him. To do so would be to dishonor the magnitude of his choice. Instead, she gave him a slow, solemn nod of acceptance. It was a gesture of profound grief and infinite gratitude. In that silent moment of commitment, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a calm he had not known since he was a boy, long before the wars began. His path was clear. He spent his final minutes preparing. He stripped off his armor and gear, leaving only the simple tunic he wore. He checked his pulse rifle one last time, not for himself, but for the fight to come. They would have to get back to that central chamber, and he knew Valerius and Jax would not make it easy. The Warden would want to take this moon intact, to seize the power source for himself. He would send a ground assault first. As if on cue, the ship's proximity alert screamed. Dozens of drop pods were descending through the atmosphere, their heat signatures blazing on the screen. Jax was coming for them. "It's time," Kalen said. He turned to Lyra. "Get to the chamber. Prepare the ritual. I'll buy you the time you need." She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "I will not leave you to fight alone." A wave of her power washed over him, not forceful, but invigorating. He felt his weariness recede, his senses sharpen. It was a gift, a farewell. They made their stand at the entrance to the caves. Kalen set up a defensive position behind a rock outcropping, his rifle sighted on the narrow canyon pass. Lyra stood beside him, her hands glowing with latent power. The first wave of consortium shock troopers advanced, their black armor a blot against the crystalline landscape. Kalen's rifle barked, spitting bolts of blue-white plasma. The first trooper fell, then a second. He was a master of his craft, his shots precise and deadly. But they were too many. They advanced under the cover of heavy weapons fire, explosions rocking the canyon walls. Lyra deflected the worst of the blasts with shimmering shields of force, but each impact drained her. Sub-Warden Jax appeared, leading the charge, a heavy-bore plasma cannon in his hands. "Kalen, face me, you coward," he roared, his voice amplified into a metallic bellow. "Your little alien, which can't protect you forever." Kalen ignored him, focusing on thinning the ranks of his soldiers. But Jax was relentless, pushing his men forward. They were being overwhelmed. "Go!" Kalen yelled at Lyra. "Now. I'll hold them here." She hesitated, her eyes filled with anguish. But she saw the strategic truth in his words. The ritual was everything. With a final, sorrowful look, she turned and fled into the darkness of the caves. Jack saw her go and laughed. "That's right. Run. There's nowhere to hide." He fired his cannon, a massive ball of energy that vaporized the rock formation Kalen was using for cover. Kalen dove aside, rolling behind another crystal spire as his position was obliterated. He was pinned down, alone. He knew he couldn't win a direct firefight. He had to change the terms of the engagement. He fell back deeper into the cave system, using his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. He became a ghost in the tunnels, striking from the shadows, leading Jax and his squad on a deadly chase through the crystalline labyrinth. But they were closing in, their motion trackers immune to the darkness. He made his final stand just outside the central chamber. He could feel the power emanating from within, could hear Lyra's low, melodic chant as she began the ritual. He had to hold this corridor. Jax and his remaining 5 troopers rounded a corner, their helmet lights cutting through the gloom. The firefight was brutal and short. Kalen took out 3 of them in the first volley, but a shot from Jax's cannon caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle skittering across the floor. Searing pain lanced through him. His arm hung limp and useless at his side. Jax advanced, a cruel smile on his face. "It's over, old man. You should have stayed in your cage." Kalen staggered to his feet, pulling the combat knife from his belt with his good hand. He was wounded, outgunned, but not broken. As Jax raised his cannon for the final shot, Kalen charged. He lunged under the weapon's barrel, driving his knife up under Jax's jaw, through the weak point in his helmet's seal. Jax's eyes went wide with shock, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. The cannon discharged, the blast going wide and striking the ceiling, bringing down a shower of rock and crystal. Jax collapsed, dead. The remaining 2 troopers, stunned by their commander's fall, were an easy target for a wave of force that erupted from the chamber entrance. Lyra stood there, her eyes blazing, as the soldiers were thrown back down the corridor, their armor clattering against the stone. Kalen stumbled toward her, clutching his wounded shoulder. Blood stained his tunic. "Is it ready?" he gasped. She nodded, her expression a mixture of grief and urgency. "The focus is prepared, but you are wounded. The trauma. It doesn't matter," he said, pushing past her into the chamber. The pool of light in the center was now a swirling vortex of incandescent energy. The air hummed with power, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. There is no other way. He walked to the edge of the pool, his legs unsteady. He turned to look at her one last time. He saw in her face the future of her people, the hope for a world reborn. He had no grand last words, no profound speech. He simply met her eyes and gave her a small, final nod. The soldier, his duty done. Then he stepped into the light. The pain was absolute. It was a fire that consumed him from the inside out, every nerve ending screaming in a symphony of agony. He felt his body being unmade, his atoms torn apart and scattered into the stream of pure energy. His consciousness, his very sense of self, was stretched to the breaking point. He was a single drop of water falling into an infinite ocean. He felt his memories burning away, his childhood, his years in the service, the faces of friends long dead. Everything that made him Kalen was dissolving into a roar of white noise and blinding light. He was dying. He was failing. The pain was too much. His will was fracturing. And then, through the storm, he felt a touch. A presence. It was Lyra, her mind reaching out to his, not to stop him, but to steady him. She shared her strength, her memories, her unyielding hope. She showed him the image of a green and peaceful world, of her people living under a serene sky. She gave him a reason to hold on. Anchored by her will, he found a new reserve of strength. He stopped fighting the energy and instead surrendered to it, guided it, became one with it. His consciousness expanded. The pain receded, replaced by a feeling of infinite connection. He was no longer Kalen, a single man in a broken body. He was the caves, the moon, the swirling nebula outside. He could feel every crystal, every grain of dust. He could see the consortium fleet in orbit, their weapons charging for the final bombardment. He felt the fear of Lyra's people huddled in the caves, and he felt Lyra's own profound sorrow and hope as she watched his sacrifice unfold. He reached out. A wave of emerald green energy erupted from the moon. It was not a weapon. It was not an attack. It was a statement. It washed over the consortium fleet, silent and irresistible. On the bridge of the Iron Hand, Warden Valerius watched in disbelief as his control panels went dark, his weapons systems powered down, and his engines sputtered into silence. Every piece of advanced technology in his fleet was rendered inert, turned into cold, dead metal. The shield was absolute, a perfect, impenetrable barrier that cut them off from their prize. The war was over. The battle was lost in an instant of silent, beautiful light. In the chamber, the vortex of energy subsided, leaving only the gently glowing pool. Lyra stood alone, the tears she had held back for so long now streaming freely down her face. Kalen was gone, but she could feel him. He was in the hum of the crystals, the warmth of the air, the soft light that now filled the cave. He was the shield. He was the guardian. He was at peace. 10 years passed. The moon, which Lyra's people now called Kalen's Rest, was a sanctuary. The emerald shield remained, a permanent feature of the system, a beautiful, silent testament to the sacrifice that had forged it. The consortium, crippled by the loss of Valerius's fleet and the public revelation of their atrocities which was broadcast from the Orhaller's data logs, had fractured into warring factions, its tyrannical grip on the galaxy broken. Life on the moon had returned. The caves were filled with the light of new crystal growth and the laughter of children who had never known war. Lyra, now the elder of her people, led them with a quiet wisdom, her heart forever marked by a bittersweet sorrow. They were rebuilding, their culture slowly being reborn in the safety of their eternal guardian. On the anniversary of his sacrifice, she made her customary pilgrimage to the central chamber. The pool of lights still glowed with a soft, steady luminescence, its warmth filling the vast cavern. It was not a memorial of cold stone, but a living presence, a silent, watchful consciousness that protected them all. She knelt at the edge of the pool and placed her palm on the surface of the liquid light. It felt warm, like a living thing. She closed her eyes and extended her thoughts, not with words, but with feelings. Gratitude, peace, remembrance. She showed him images of the new life he had protected, of the children playing in the sun-dappled caves, of the hope he had bought with his own existence. She felt a response, not in words, but as a faint, familiar warmth that enveloped her. It was a feeling of profound calm, of duty fulfilled. He was still there. He was watching. His sacrifice had not been an ending, but a transformation. He had traded his life for a purpose, his identity for a legacy of peace. He was the silent guardian, the jaded soldier who had found his final, truest honor in the heart of a lonely moon, forever holding the line.